A billionaire accidentally saw his son dancing with the black female chef in the garden. When he tried to uncover the chef's true identity, he was shocked and left speechless. Weston Anderson had spent a lifetime ensuring there were no surprises. His days followed a strict routine, his empire flourished under his meticulous control, and his home ran like clockwork. There was no room for disorder, no space for the unexpected. And yet, as he walked down the grand hallway of his estate that afternoon, something made him stop. Through the wide glass window overlooking the garden, he saw his 12-year-old son, Leonardo. But the boy wasn't alone. Leonardo was dancing. The sight was so foreign, so out of place, that Weston narrowed his eyes as if to confirm he wasn't imagining things. Leonardo had never shown an interest in dance before, had never expressed interest in much of anything since his mother passed. But here he was, feet moving hesitantly but deliberately, guided by none other than Adelaide, the house cook. Weston felt his chest tighten. Adelaide was a quiet presence in the household, someone he had barely noticed since hiring her 6 months ago. She did her job efficiently, stayed out of the way, never overstepped. But now she was here, in his garden, with his son, her dark hands gently correcting Leonardo's posture, her voice calm as she instructed him. Leonardo stumbled, nearly falling, but instead of frustration, the boy laughed. A sound Weston hadn't heard in years. It was light, unguarded, and completely unlike the reserved child he had come to know. The realization unsettled him. Why her? Why now? His son had spent the last 3 years locked in grief, retreating into himself, showing little interest in the world around him. Weston had tried to give him stability, had provided tutors, structure, everything a boy could need. And yet, it was this woman, this cook, who had somehow reached him. His gaze flicked back to Adelaide. She wasn't just indulging a child's whim. Her movements were precise, controlled, not playful improvisation, but the steps of someone trained, someone who had done this before. A bitter taste rose in his throat. There was something about her, something Weston didn't like. Weston wasn't a man prone to emotion, but something about this scene ignited an irritation deep in his gut. A woman like Adelaide, a house employee, a cook, had no business holding this kind of influence over his son. Leonardo was supposed to be under his guidance, his protection. He clenched his jaw. Enough of this. With a controlled, deliberate pace, he stepped outside, his polished shoes clicking against the stone path. The laughter died instantly. Leonardo saw him first, and the light in his face flickered, replaced by something Weston recognized well: hesitation. The boy's posture stiffened, his hands dropping to his sides, the easy joy he had displayed moments ago now buried beneath caution. Adelaide, however, did not flinch. She merely straightened, wiping her hands on the apron tied around her waist, and met his gaze without a hint of unease. Weston didn't like that either. What exactly is going on here? His voice was steady, cool. Leonardo shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance toward Adelaide, as if hoping she would answer for him. But the woman didn't. At least not right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough for tension to settle between them. Then, in a voice as level as his own, she said simply, "We were practicing, sir." Weston's lips pressed into a firm line. Practicing. His gaze flicked back to Leonardo. Since when? The boy hesitated, staring at his shoes. For a while now, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Weston's irritation deepened. He had never noticed. And why hadn't Leonardo told him? Before he could voice the question, Adelaide spoke again, her tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of quiet defiance. Because he had no one to practice with. Weston turned to her sharply. There was something in her words, something not just about dance, but about something more, something deeper. He didn't like the way she said it. Weston took a slow breath, reining in the unfamiliar feeling clawing at his composure. He wouldn't argue about this in front of his son. Weston turned sharply, heading back toward the house without a word. Yet, just as he reached the doorway, a hushed voice stopped him. Leonardo. He had leaned toward Adelaide, whispering something Weston couldn't hear. And then the boy smiled. It wasn't the hesitant, guarded smile he gave Weston. It wasn't forced or practiced. It was genuine, conspiratorial. Weston's stomach twisted. What was going on here? Back in his office, the feeling refused to settle. He sat at his desk, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes fixed on the dark wood surface, as thoughts swirled in his mind. The house was his domain. Everything that happened under its roof was supposed to be within his grasp. And yet, he had been blindsided. Adelaide had been in his house for months, moving about unnoticed, blending into the daily routines. A cook, nothing more. And yet, in some inexplicable way, she had managed to connect with Leonardo in a way that he never had. That alone was enough to put Weston on edge. His fingers moved over the keyboard, pulling up the employee records on his screen. Adelaide Ruiz, 29. No criminal history. Hired through an agency. Background check clear. She was, on paper, exactly what she appeared to be. Weston exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the desk. His instincts had never failed him before. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. A pause. His hands hovered over the keyboard. Then, as if guided by a force outside himself, he typed. Adelaide Ruiz ballerina. At first, the search brought up nothing of interest. Random social media accounts, irrelevant articles. But then, there it was. A headline buried beneath years of internet dust. An old article from a performing arts magazine. Young ballet prodigy disappears from the stage without explanation. Weston clicked. The page loaded, revealing a photograph of a much younger Adelaide. She was poised in a white ballet costume, standing on a grand stage, arms lifted in perfect form. Her expression was serene, confident, as if she had been born to belong there. The article described a rising star in the ballet world, a dancer with an unmatched gift. She had been on the cusp of an international career, praised by critics, sought after by elite companies. And then, nothing. One day, without warning, she vanished from the spotlight. No farewell performance, no scandal, no explanation. Weston leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Why would someone with that kind of talent walk away? And more importantly, what was she doing in his house, cooking in his kitchen, teaching his son to dance? There was only one way to find out. The kitchen smelled of warm spices, a faint trace of something baking in the oven. Adelaide was at the counter, her movements methodical as she wiped down the surface. She didn't look up when Weston entered. He strode toward the center of the room, pulled out his phone, and placed it on the counter. The article's headline glowed on the screen. Care to explain this? For the first time since he had met her, Weston saw something flicker across Adelaide's face. Surprise, fleeting but undeniable. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she set down the towel in her hands, looked at the screen, then back at him. You've been looking me up. Weston folded his arms. I don't like mysteries in my home. A beat of silence. Then Adelaide exhaled, fingers brushing the edge of the counter. "I suppose I should have expected this," she murmured. "You're not the type of man to let things go unanswered." Weston said nothing. He only waited. Adelaide's gaze lingered on the article a moment longer before she lifted her chin, meeting his eyes directly. "I was a dancer," she admitted. Weston's voice was measured. "You were more than that. You were a star." A bitter smile touched her lips. A star that burned out before it could shine. A strange weight settled in Weston's chest. He hadn't expected that answer, hadn't expected the quiet resignation in her tone. "What happened?" Adelaide hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she weighed whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed. "I lost everything." Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it before. Weston didn't push. He simply waited. "When I was 22, dance was my entire world," she said. "It was all I knew, all I cared about. I trained endlessly, pushed myself beyond limits because I believed I was meant for something greater." She paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. "And I wasn't alone." Weston frowned. "Who?" "My fiancé," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Adrian. He was a dancer too. We had trained together since we were children. We were supposed to take on the world together. We were offered an international tour, a dream we had worked for our entire lives." Something in her tone made Weston's stomach tighten. He already knew where this was going. "The day before our biggest performance," she continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "Adrian was hit by a car." Weston remained silent. "He died instantly." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. After a long moment, Adelaide exhaled. "After that, I couldn't dance. I couldn't even hear music without feeling like a part of me had been ripped away. Everything I had built my life around was gone. And so, I disappeared." Weston let her words sink in. He had expected something tragic, but not this. Not a grief so raw it had driven her to abandon everything. "So you became a cook?" he asked, not unkindly. Adelaide let out a breath of amusement, though there was no real humor in it. "I needed something far removed from dance. Something practical. Something safe." Weston exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "And now?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Now, I teach your son." The words hit him harder than he expected. "You could have kept ignoring it," Weston said slowly. "Why help him?" She hesitated, then said, "Because he reminds me of myself at his age." Weston stiffened. "How?" Adelaide's expression softened. "Because he doesn't smile, Mr. Anderson." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Weston clenched his jaw, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. His son had been fading ever since his mother died, retreating into himself, into books and routines. He had thought that giving Leonardo stability and security was enough. But Adelaide had seen something he had missed. Weston barely spoke at dinner that evening. Leonardo sat across from him, eating quietly, his posture straight, his eyes on his plate. The boy had always been well-mannered, always followed the unspoken rules of their household. But tonight, Weston noticed something different. There was a new energy in the way he moved, a restlessness beneath the surface, like he was holding something back. Weston didn't ask. He never had to. Leonardo was the kind of child who spoke only when spoken to, who kept his thoughts tucked away unless prompted. So, when the boy finally put his fork down and lifted his gaze, Weston already knew something was coming. "I want to enter a dance competition." The words hung in the air between them, startling in their boldness. Weston had expected many things. This was not one of them. He set his glass down slowly, studying his son's face. "You want to compete?" His voice was measured, careful. Leonardo nodded, his hands clenched into small fists on the table. "Yes. I've been training with Adelaide, and I want to take it seriously." Weston didn't reply immediately. He was too busy processing the sheer weight of what Leonardo had just said. The boy had never once shown real passion for anything. He had done what was expected, excelled in school, behaved properly, stayed out of trouble. But this was different. "You understand what a competition means, don't you?" Weston's tone was neutral, but his gaze was sharp. "It's not just dancing in the garden. There are expectations, pressure, judgment." "I know." Leonardo's voice didn't waver. Weston leaned back, watching him carefully. He could have dismissed it outright, could have shut it down like any other childhood whim. But something about the way Leonardo sat there, shoulders squared, jaw set, it made Weston pause. "If you do this," Weston said after a long silence, "you do it properly." Leonardo nodded again. "I will. And Adelaide trains you." A flicker of something passed through the boy's eyes. Relief, maybe, or determination. "Yes." Weston exhaled, glancing toward the kitchen. He still wasn't sure what to make of the woman who had managed to draw something out of his son that he himself had failed to reach. But if Leonardo was serious about this, if he was willing to commit, Weston wouldn't stand in his way. "You start tomorrow," he said simply. Leonardo's lips parted slightly, like he hadn't expected such a quick agreement. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." The conversation was over, but something told Weston this was only the beginning. The next morning, Adelaide was waiting in the ballroom. The room had been mostly unused for years, save for the occasional formal event. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. Leonardo stood at the entrance, his nerves obvious in the way he shifted on his feet. Weston stood further back, arms crossed, watching. Adelaide had changed. Gone was the soft-spoken cook who moved quietly in the background of their home. Here, in this space, she stood tall, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding. She gestured toward the center of the room. "Show me what you've got." Leonardo hesitated, then stepped forward. He positioned himself, took a breath, and moved. It was awkward, hesitant. His feet weren't sure of themselves and his arms were stiff. But there was effort. There was focus. He made it through a few measures before stumbling. Adelaide didn't react. She simply crossed her arms. "Again." Leonardo frowned but straightened up. He tried again. This time, he got further, but then he missed a step, lost his rhythm. Again. Weston remained still, watching as his son repeated the sequence over and over. Each time he failed, Adelaide said the same thing. Again. By the fifth attempt, sweat beaded at Leonardo's forehead. His breaths came harder. His movements grew sluggish. But he didn't stop. Weston had expected frustration, maybe even anger. He had half expected his son to storm off after the third failed attempt. But Leonardo stayed. Again and again. By the 10th attempt, Adelaide finally stepped forward. "Enough for today," she said. "Tomorrow we fix your footwork." Leonardo was panting, but there was something in his eyes, a fire Weston had never seen before. Weston turned, heading toward the door. Before he left, he heard Adelaide speak once more. "You've got heart, kid," she said. "That's a good start." Weston didn't stop walking, but something about those words stayed with him. Leonardo lay flat on the ballroom floor, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. His muscles burned, his legs ached, but his mind buzzed with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something stronger, something deeper. Adelaide had pushed him harder than ever today, and yet he hadn't stopped. He hadn't walked away. That was new. For years, he had been the quiet kid, the boy who blended into the background, who did what was expected but never more. But now, something inside him was shifting. His phone vibrated beside him, the screen lighting up. He grabbed it, still breathing hard. A message. "Santiago Beltran. I heard you're competing this year." That's cute. Don't get your hopes up, though. You're not ready for this." Leonardo stared at the words, his fingers tightening around the phone. Santiago had been the champion 2 years in a row. Everyone knew his name. He had the experience, the reputation, the confidence. And, apparently, he also had the arrogance. Leonardo swallowed hard. He hadn't even stepped onto a competition stage yet. And already, someone was telling him he wasn't good enough. His stomach twisted. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was too big for him. Maybe he wasn't ready. The ballroom door creaked, and he glanced up just as Adelaide stepped inside. She took one look at him, then at the phone in his hand, and sighed. "Who got in your head?" Leonardo hesitated before handing her the phone. She scanned the message, her expression unreadable. Then she handed it back and crossed her arms. "You believe him?" Leonardo hesitated. "I don't know." Adelaide studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Listen, kid, you're going to run into people like this your whole life. People who want to make you doubt yourself before you even get started. You got 2 choices. You can let it shake you, or you can let it push you." Leonardo looked back down at the message, his fingers tightening around the phone again. Adelaide's voice softened, just a little. "If you won out, now's the time. But if you want to prove him wrong, you'd better be ready to work for it." Leonardo didn't answer right away, but something inside him, something small but unshakable, whispered that quitting wasn't an option. He locked the screen, set the phone aside, and met Adelaide's eyes. "I want to prove him wrong." Adelaide gave a small nod. "Then get some rest. Tomorrow we work harder." Weston had noticed the shift in his son, the way Leonardo moved around the house, more focused, more determined. The way he returned from practice, exhausted, but strangely alive. And now, tonight, he saw something else. Leonardo sat at the dining table, absently picking at his food. His shoulders were tense, his mind somewhere far away. Weston didn't need to ask to know something was weighing on him. For a moment, he considered letting it go. He had spent years keeping conversations with his son surface level, sticking to school, responsibilities, things that were safe. But tonight, for some reason, he didn't want to. "You're distracted," Weston said, keeping his voice even. Leonardo blinked, looking up. "Huh?" Weston set his fork down. "Something's on your mind." Leonardo hesitated, then exhaled. "Santiago Beltran. He messaged me." Weston arched a brow. He knew the name. He had done his own research. Santiago was the reigning champion, older, more experienced. If Leonardo was stepping into this world, it was only natural he'd cross paths with him. "And?" Weston prompted. Leonardo swallowed. "He said I don't have a chance." Weston studied his son's face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled into the napkin in his lap. He had seen that look before, but never on Leonardo. It was frustration. It was doubt. It was the weight of wanting something but fearing he wasn't enough. Weston leaned back in his chair. "Do you believe him?" Leonardo hesitated. Weston exhaled. "Let me tell you something. People like Santiago, they don't waste their time on people they don't see as competition." Leonardo frowned slightly. "If he's going out of his way to tell you that you won't win, it means he's already thinking about you," Weston continued. "And that means you're worth thinking about." Leonardo stared at him for a long moment, like he was absorbing the words, turning them over in his head. Weston picked up his fork again, signaling that the conversation was over. "Eat your dinner. You'll need the energy." The competition day had arrived, and the atmosphere inside the theater was thick with anticipation. Backstage, dancers stretched and whispered among themselves, their movements precise, their nerves barely contained beneath layers of practiced confidence. The glow of the stage lights spilled into the wings, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled sound of applause signaled the end of another performance. Leonardo stood in the waiting area, adjusting the straps of his dance shoes, fingers pressing into the worn leather as he exhaled slowly. The weight of expectation settled heavily on his shoulders. He had trained for this, pushed himself through exhaustion, fallen and risen again more times than he could count. But now, standing here with his name moments away from being called, the familiar doubt crept in. Adelaide was beside him, her presence steady, unshaken. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "Breathe," she reminded him, her voice even. "You've done the work. The only thing left to do is dance." Leonardo nodded, inhaling deeply, though the tightness in his chest remained. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of Weston standing near the edge of the backstage area, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. For years, his father had watched him with the kind of detached scrutiny reserved for numbers on a ledger, something to be measured, assessed. But tonight, there was something different in his stance, in the way his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than usual. The announcer's voice rang through the theater, clear and unwavering. "Next, we welcome Leonardo Anderson to the stage." Leonardo stepped forward, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs as he moved past the curtain and into the glaring stage lights. The audience beyond was nothing more than a sea of blurred faces, their collective silence pressing against him, waiting. The music began, a slow, deliberate melody that curled through the vast space, wrapping itself around him. He took his first step, and with it, the world shrank down to the movement of his body, the rhythm guiding him forward. His limbs flowed through the routine, each step ingrained into muscle memory, rehearsed over and over until it had become part of him. There was no room for hesitation, no second chances. As the final sequence approached, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. The turn, the one he had failed more times than he could count, the one that had sent him crashing to the floor in training, testing every ounce of his endurance. The music swelled. The moment was upon him, and in a single breath he pushed off the ground. Time stretched, his body turned, weightless in the air, the theater spinning around him. The landing came fast, his feet striking the floor, grounding him, and for a split second, there was silence. Then, the applause erupted. Leonardo remained still, his chest rising and falling, his mind catching up to what had just happened. He had done it. Not just finished, not just survived, but completed the sequence exactly as he had envisioned. His gaze instinctively moved toward the audience, scanning the rows until he found Weston. His father was standing now, a rare sight, his expression unreadable yet somehow different. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was something deeper. Next to him, Adelaide nodded once, her approval subtle but unmistakable. The results came swiftly. Santiago Beltran was announced as the winner, as expected. The crowd cheered, and Santiago stepped forward, wearing the confidence of someone who had done this before, who knew what it meant to stand at the top. Leonardo felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but before it could settle, the announcer spoke again. We would also like to present a special award for artistic expression, recognizing not just technical skill, but passion, connection, and heart. This award goes to Leonardo Anderson. A fresh wave of applause filled the theater, the sound of it wrapping around him. It wasn't the first-place trophy, but as the medal was placed around his neck, he realized something. It wasn't about winning. It was about proving to himself that he belonged on this stage, that he was capable of standing among the best. Outside the theater, the cool night air brushed against his skin, offering relief from the heat of the stage lights. Weston stood beside him, hands in his pockets, his usual reserved demeanor intact, but something had shifted. For a long moment, neither spoke, letting the quiet settle between them. Then, in a gesture that was as unexpected as it was grounding, Weston placed a hand on Leonardo's shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Leonardo thought for a moment, the weight of everything still sinking in. "Proud," he finally answered. Weston gave a small nod, his grip firm. "Good." There was nothing more to say, no long speeches, no forced reassurances. Just this moment, simple, steady, enough. Leonardo's training didn't stop after the competition. If anything, he pushed himself harder. Each morning, before the house had fully stirred, he was already in the ballroom, practicing his footwork, fine-tuning each movement. The drive that had sparked in him before the competition had not faded. It had grown, solidified into something stronger, something relentless. Weston watched from a distance, uncertain of what to make of it. He had spent years thinking his son lacked direction, that he was fragile in ways Weston couldn't understand. But this was not fragility. This was determination. It unsettled him, not because he doubted Leonardo's ability, but because he wasn't sure how to reconcile this version of his son with the boy he had always known. One afternoon, as Leonardo wrapped up another grueling session, the sound of deliberate footsteps echoed through the ballroom. Santiago Beltran stood at the entrance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Leonardo wiped the sweat from his brow, but didn't speak first. Santiago smirked. "You got lucky with that award." Leonardo met his gaze, his stance unwavering. "Maybe, but I earned it." Santiago stepped further into the room, his confidence effortless, like someone who had never had to question his place in the world. "Don't think for a second you'll get that close next year. I won't go easy on you." Leonardo held his ground. "I wasn't expecting you to." Weston, standing near the doorway, observed the exchange. There was no hesitation in Leonardo's voice, no uncertainty in the way he carried himself. Weston realized with an odd sense of both pride and unease that his son had changed. He was no longer waiting for permission to be great. He had made that decision on his own. Later that evening, as Weston sat in his office, he found his thoughts drifting to Adelaide. She had been the catalyst for all of this, the one who had given Leonardo something neither discipline nor structure alone could provide: purpose, confidence. For months, he had viewed her as nothing more than a house employee, someone who existed in the periphery of his carefully structured world. But that wasn't true anymore, was it? He found her in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, moving with the same quiet efficiency she always had. When she noticed him lingering in the doorway, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I owe you a thank you," Weston said finally. Adelaide glanced at him, unimpressed. "For what?" "For Leonardo," he admitted, his voice slower, more deliberate than usual. "He wouldn't be where he is now without you." She exhaled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't do this for you." "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was filled with unspoken things, with acknowledgements neither was quite ready to put into words. Weston had spent a lifetime calculating outcomes, managing risks, ensuring nothing was left to chance. But Adelaide had stepped into his world and done something he had never been able to. She had given Leonardo a reason to fight for something. And Weston wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that she had done it, or the fact that he was grateful for it. Days passed, and life inside the Anderson estate settled into a rhythm. Leonardo trained. Adelaide pushed him. Weston observed from the sidelines, caught between a pride he didn't know how to express and an unfamiliar sense of detachment. Then came the call. An opportunity. A deal that would expand Weston's business into European markets. A venture that would require his presence in London for at least a year. It was everything he had spent his career working toward, the kind of move that secured legacies. But it would mean leaving. He sat in his office, staring at the proposal, the numbers aligning perfectly, the logistics already falling into place. By all accounts, it was a flawless opportunity. Except that evening, he told Leonardo over dinner. "I'll be moving to London for a while," Weston said, watching his son's reaction carefully. "The business needs me there." Leonardo didn't look shocked. If anything, he looked indifferent. He set his fork down and nodded. "Okay." That was it. No questions, no protests. Weston frowned. "That's all you have to say?" Leonardo shrugged. "I can take care of myself." Weston stared at him, something tightening in his chest. He had expected resistance, a plea to stay maybe. But Leonardo wasn't that boy anymore. He wasn't waiting for his father to dictate his life. And that should have been a good thing. But for the first time, Weston wasn't sure if it was. Later that night, unable to push the thought from his mind, he found himself outside in the garden. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth filling the space between them as he spotted Adelaide standing near the patio, gazing up at the stars. "I'm leaving," Weston said, his voice quieter than usual. Adelaide didn't look at him right away. When she finally did, there was no surprise in her eyes. "I figured," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to lose what I've built." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then decide what's more important, what you've built or what you're building." The words settled heavily between them. Weston had spent years believing success was measured by numbers, by empire, by control. But now, standing here, he wasn't so sure. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. Adelaide's words followed Weston long after he left the garden. He carried them with him into the quiet of his office where the weight of his decision pressed against him like an anchor. The London contract sat open on his laptop, the cursor blinking at the empty signature line. It was a deal that would secure everything he had worked for, his company's expansion, his legacy, the power he had spent years building. But for the first time, the thought of signing it didn't feel like victory. The next morning, Adelaide called Leonardo into the ballroom for one final test. "If you can get through this routine without a single mistake," she told him, her voice steady, "you'll be ready." Leonardo met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He knew what this meant. The hardest routine yet. No corrections, no second chances. And Weston would be watching. The music began, and Leonardo moved with confidence, his feet sure, his posture steady. Every pivot, every turn, every extension carried a precision that hadn't been there before. His balance was unwavering, his breath controlled. He had learned discipline, strength, and something more, trust in himself. Weston stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes trained on his son. He had expected nerves, hesitation, but what he saw instead was something undeniable. Leonardo no longer needed him. When the music ended, Adelaide said nothing at first. She simply nodded, the smallest smile tugging at her lips. "You're ready," she said. Leonardo exhaled, a mixture of relief and triumph settling into his bones. But Weston? He felt something entirely different, something hollow. That night, in the solitude of his office, Weston stared at the contract again. He reached for the trackpad, his fingers hovering over the digital signature field, but his hand wouldn't move. Instead, he closed the laptop. 2 days later, bags packed, Weston stood in the doorway of the house he had built, ready to leave for London. Adelaide was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, her movements unhurried. He lingered for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," he said. She glanced at him but didn't stop working. "For what?" "For everything." Adelaide smiled faintly, but there was no attachment in it, no expectation. "Safe travels, Mr. Anderson." Something about those words didn't sit right. And yet, Weston turned and walked out the door. London was everything he expected it to be. The meetings were efficient, the contracts lucrative. His business associates congratulated him on the expansion, praised his vision, toasted to his success. And yet, in the quiet of his hotel room, overlooking a city that should have thrilled him, Weston felt something entirely foreign. Emptiness. Days passed, then weeks. He went through the motions, attended the meetings, signed the documents. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the numbers, on the deals, his mind kept drifting back home. Then, one evening, a letter arrived at his hotel. Not an email, not a phone call, a physical letter written in his son's careful handwriting. "Dad, you always taught me to fight for what matters. Are you sure you've done the same?" That was all it said. But it was enough. The next morning, Weston booked a flight home. When Weston stepped through the front door, the house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. He set his bags down and walked through the hallways, taking in everything he had left behind. He found Leonardo in the ballroom, stretching, focused. The boy looked up, saw him standing there, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Leonardo smiled. Not a small, polite smile. Not the hesitant kind he used to give, a real one. Weston didn't say anything. He just nodded, and somehow that was enough. Later that evening, he sought out Adelaide. She was in the garden this time, sitting on the stone bench, watching the sky darken into dusk. When he approached, she didn't look at him right away. "I thought you'd be gone longer," she murmured. "I thought so too," Weston admitted. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I used to think I didn't need anyone," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. That being alone meant being in control. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "But I was wrong." Adelaide studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then slowly, she nodded. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. And Weston understood. A year later, the competition hall buzzed with the same electric anticipation. But this time, Leonardo wasn't the boy hiding in the wings. He wasn't unsure of himself. He stepped onto that stage with confidence, his movements sure, his mind clear. Across from him, Santiago Beltran stood ready, but the smirk was gone. This time, Santiago knew Leonardo wasn't here to play. The music started, and Leonardo danced, not just with skill, not just with technique, but with something real. Weston and Adelaide watched from the crowd, standing side by side. No words were needed. When the final scores were announced, Leonardo's name was at the top. A standing ovation followed, the roar of applause shaking the auditorium. But as Leonardo turned toward the audience, scanning the faces, his eyes landed on the only two that mattered: Weston, Adelaide. And for the first time in his life, Weston understood the true weight of success. It had never been about winning. It had always been about coming home. This story is a beautifully crafted journey of transformation, resilience, and the true meaning of success. At its core, it is not just about dance, but about rediscovering one's purpose, confronting fears, and redefining relationships. Leonardo's evolution from a timid, grieving boy to a confident dancer is deeply moving. His determination, despite failures and doubts, teaches the value of perseverance and self-belief. Weston's journey is equally compelling. A man who once measured success by control and wealth slowly learns that true fulfillment comes not from power, but from connection. His initial emotional detachment from his son gives way to understanding, pride, and ultimately, the realization that love and family hold greater value than ambition. Adelaide serves as the quiet force of change, showing both father and son that strength is not just about discipline, but about having the courage to embrace vulnerability. The story reminds us that true victory is not about trophies or accolades, but about finding what truly matters. It is a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of following one's passion, and the realization that sometimes the greatest success is simply having the courage to come home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.